The grand halls of Kensington Palace buzzed with unusual energy this morning as Prince William Alexander strode through the marble corridors with purpose. His footsteps echoed against the ancient walls, each step carrying the weight of momentous news that would shake the very foundations of the royal household. Staff members noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he made his way to his private office. Just 5 minutes earlier, William had received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end belonged to his former sister-in-law, Lady Margaret Thornfield, once married to his younger brother Prince Henry before their highly publicized separation 3 years ago. Margaret had been living quietly in Canada, away from the relentless scrutiny of the British press and the suffocating protocols of royal life. "William," her voice had trembled through the phone, "I need you to know before anyone else finds out. I'm coming back to London, and I'm bringing evidence that will expose the truth about why Henry and I really separated. The palace has been lying to protect certain people, and I won't stay silent anymore." The revelation hit William like a thunderbolt. For 3 years, the official story had been that Margaret and Henry grew apart due to the pressures of royal life and media attention. The palace had painted a picture of an amicable separation between two people who simply wanted different things. But William knew there were darker secrets lurking beneath the polished surface of royal public relations. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have recordings, William. Conversations with palace officials, private meetings where decisions were made about my future without my consent. They tried to control every aspect of my life, even after Henry and I separated. They threatened my reputation, my family's safety, all to maintain their perfect image." As William sat in his leather chair, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens, his mind raced through the implications. Margaret had always been different from other royal spouses. She had arrived as a successful actress from America, bringing with her a fierce independence and unwillingness to simply smile and wave on command. The palace had struggled to mold her into their vision of royal propriety. He remembered the heated arguments behind closed doors, the way palace advisors whispered about the Margaret problem when they thought no one was listening. There had been incidents covered up, stories buried, and a systematic campaign to discredit her whenever she stepped out of line. William had witnessed it all but had been powerless to intervene. Bound by his own position and the complex web of royal obligations, the phone call had lasted 20 minutes. With Margaret detailing her plans to return to London within the week. She had spent months gathering evidence, working with investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corruption among the elite. Her goal was not revenge, she insisted, but justice and the truth that had been denied for far too long. "I won't let them destroy another woman who dares to speak up," Margaret had said, her voice carrying a steely determination. "There are others who have been silenced, other wives and partners who were pushed out when they became inconvenient. This ends now." William felt a mixture of admiration and terror. He admired Margaret's courage but feared the chaos her revelations would unleash. The royal family was already walking a tightrope with public opinion, dealing with various scandals and a younger generation that questioned the relevance of monarchy in modern times. Margaret's bombshell could be the catalyst that brought everything crashing down. As he sat in the silence of his office, William began to understand the impossible position he was in. As heir to the throne, he had a duty to protect the institution of the monarchy. But as a man who had witnessed injustice firsthand, he felt morally obligated to support Margaret's quest for truth. The weight of this internal conflict pressed down on him like a physical force. His phone buzzed with urgent messages from palace communications staff, security teams, and government officials. Somehow, word had already begun to leak that something significant was happening. The royal rumor mill was as efficient as any intelligence network, and whispers of Margaret's impending return were already circulating among those in the know. William realized he had perhaps hours before the story broke publicly. He needed to decide whether to stand with the palace establishment or support Margaret's explosive revelations. Either choice would have consequences that would reverberate through the monarchy for generations to come. The next chapter of his life, and possibly the future of the royal family itself, hung in the balance as he prepared to make the most important decision of his reign. 2 hours after Margaret's shocking phone call, Prince William found himself in an emergency meeting with the most powerful figures in the royal establishment. The Queen's private secretary, Lord Edmund Blackwood, sat at the head of the mahogany table in the palace's most secure conference room. His weathered face showed decades of managing royal crises, but even he appeared shaken by the morning's developments. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served the crown for over 40 years, "we have a situation that requires immediate and decisive action. Lady Margaret's threats cannot be taken lightly, especially given her connections to certain members of the international press." Around the table sat the palace's inner circle of damage control specialists. There was Victoria Sterling, the sharp-tongued communications director who had orchestrated countless cover-ups, and Sir James Hartwell, the security chief whose job was to protect royal secrets at any cost. Each face reflected the same grim understanding, that their carefully constructed world was about to be tested like never before. William listened as they outlined their strategy to discredit Margaret before she could present her evidence. Victoria had already begun drafting press releases that would paint Margaret as mentally unstable, driven by bitterness over her failed marriage. "We'll leak stories about her erratic behavior during the final months of her marriage," Victoria explained coldly. "Sources close to the palace will express concern for her well-being and suggest she needs professional help rather than a platform for wild accusations." The plan disgusted William, but he remained silent as they continued. Sir James detailed how they could use Margaret's past against her, highlighting her struggles with anxiety during her royal duties and her brief stay at a private clinic for stress management. They would twist her genuine mental health challenges into weapons to destroy her credibility. "We've done this before," Lord Blackwood reminded the room. "The public always chooses to believe the palace over a disgruntled former royal. We simply need to control the narrative before she can establish hers." But William's mind kept returning to Margaret's words about other women who had been silenced. He thought about the young duchess who had mysteriously withdrawn from public life after asking too many questions about palace finances. He remembered the foreign princess who had tried to modernize royal protocols and suddenly found herself isolated and eventually divorced. A pattern of behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. His phone vibrated with a text message that made his blood run cold. It was from his younger brother Henry, who was supposed to be on a private retreat in Switzerland. "William, Margaret called me too. She's right about everything. I've been a coward for too long, but I'm flying back to London tonight. We need to talk before this explodes." The realization that Henry was returning sent shockwaves through William's already turbulent thoughts. His brother had been the golden boy, the charming prince who could do no wrong in the public eye. But William knew the truth about Henry's struggles with the palace establishment, and how they had systematically destroyed his relationship with Margaret through manipulation and psychological warfare. As the meeting continued around him, William made a decision that would change everything. He stood up abruptly, causing all conversation to stop. "I need to make something very clear," he announced, his voice carrying a new authority that surprised even him. "Margaret will not be discredited or silenced again. If she has evidence of wrongdoing, then we need to address it honestly, not destroy her reputation to protect ourselves." The silence in the room was deafening. Lord Blackwood's face turned pale while Victoria's mouth opened in shock. Sir James leaned back in his chair, clearly calculating the security implications of William's sudden rebellion against established protocol. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Blackwood said carefully, "you may not fully understand the implications of what you're suggesting. Lady Margaret's allegations could destabilize the entire institution. Our duty is to protect the crown, even from those who would use personal grievances to cause harm." William felt a surge of anger at the condescending tone. For years, he had watched these people manipulate situations and destroy lives in the name of protecting the monarchy, but he was beginning to understand that their version of protection was actually corruption disguised as duty. Perhaps it's time the institution faced some honest scrutiny, William replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. If we've done things wrong, then we need to acknowledge it and make changes, not silence the people brave enough to speak out. The meeting ended in chaos, with Lord Blackwood demanding time to consult with other senior advisors, and Victoria frantically making phone calls to media contacts. William left the conference room knowing he had just declared war on the very system he was supposed to inherit and lead. As he walked back to his private quarters, William felt a strange mixture of terror and liberation. For the first time in his life, he was choosing truth over convenience, justice over institutional loyalty. But he also knew that his decision would make him a target of the same forces that had tried to destroy Margaret. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. Your Royal Highness, this is investigative journalist Sarah Chun. Lady Margaret has provided me with some very interesting recordings. I think you should hear them before tomorrow's publication deadline. Can we meet tonight? That evening, Prince William met journalist Sarah Chun at a small, discreet cafe in South London, far from the watchful eyes of palace security and media photographers. Sarah was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes that suggested she had seen enough corruption to be cynical, but still believed in the power of truth to create change. Your Royal Highness? Sarah began quietly, sliding a tablet across the small wooden table. What you're about to hear will shock you. Even though you lived through some of these events, Lady Margaret has been recording conversations for over 4 years, including some from before her separation from Prince Henry. William put on the earphones Sarah provided and listened as his world began to crumble. The first recording was from a meeting he vaguely remembered, held in Lord Blackwood's office 2 weeks after Margaret had given a speech about domestic violence that was deemed too political by palace standards. Lord Blackwood's voice came through clearly. Lady Margaret has become a liability that we can no longer manage. Her American independence and refusal to follow protocol is damaging our carefully maintained image. We need to begin the process of isolating her from royal duties and eventually from Prince Henry himself. Victoria Sterling's voice joined the conversation. I've already begun planting stories about her difficult personality with our media contacts. If we're patient and strategic, we can make it seem like the separation was her choice, driven by her inability to adapt to royal life. But the most devastating moment came when William heard his own father's voice agreeing with the plan. Margaret must be handled like we handled the others who became too independent. Cut off her support systems, limit her public appearances, and make her feel so isolated that leaving becomes preferable to staying. William pulled off the earphones, his hands shaking. Sarah watched his reaction carefully, recognizing the moment when someone's entire worldview collapsed. There's more, she said gently. Margaret wasn't the first, and according to these recordings, there's a systematic process for dealing with royal spouses who don't comply with palace expectations. The next recording featured Sir James Hotwell discussing surveillance of Margaret's private communications, including her phone calls to her family in America and her therapy sessions. They had been monitoring her mental health struggles not to provide support, but to gather ammunition for potential character assassination if she ever spoke out against them. They were planning her downfall from the beginning, Sarah explained. Every moment of stress, every private conversation, every vulnerable moment was catalogued and stored for future use. When she finally separated from Prince Henry, they had enough material to destroy her reputation completely if needed. William felt sick as he realized how naive he had been. He had witnessed Margaret's increasing isolation and Henry's growing depression, but he had attributed it to the normal pressures of royal life. Now he understood that it was a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare designed to break them both down. Sarah showed him documents that revealed similar patterns with other royal family members over the past 20 years. Foreign princesses who had divorced after brief marriages, distant cousins who had withdrawn from public life, and even some senior royals who had suffered mysterious health crises after challenging palace authority. The pattern is clear, Sarah continued. Anyone who threatens the palace's control narrative becomes a target for systematic destruction. They use their media connections, their security apparatus, and even family pressure to isolate and discredit threats. The most shocking revelation came when Sarah played a recording from just 6 months ago, long after Margaret had moved to Canada. Victoria Sterling was heard discussing plans to destroy Margaret's new career opportunities and her relationships with potential romantic partners. They weren't content to simply remove her from royal life. They wanted to ensure she could never rebuild successfully anywhere. This is why she's coming forward now, Sarah explained. They've continued to sabotage her life even after she left quietly. She realized that staying silent wasn't protection. It was just delayed destruction. William's phone had been buzzing constantly during their meeting, with urgent messages from palace officials demanding to know his whereabouts. But the most important message came from Prince Henry. "Brother, I'm landing at Heathrow in 2 hours. Meet me at the old hunting lodge. We need to plan our strategy before tomorrow. Margaret deserves justice, and so do all the others they've destroyed." Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave. "Your Royal Highness, Lady Margaret's story publishes tomorrow morning in newspapers across 3 countries simultaneously. The palace won't be able to suppress this or control the narrative like they usually do. The question is whether you'll support her publicly or let them destroy her one final time." As William sat alone in the cafe after Sarah left, he realized that tomorrow would mark a fundamental shift in the British monarchy. Margaret's revelations would expose decades of corruption and abuse of power, but they would also provide an opportunity for real reform. The institution could either evolve and acknowledge its failures or double down on its authoritarian approach and face potential abolition. He thought about his future reign and the kind of king he wanted to become. He could be another figurehead controlled by the palace establishment, or he could be the monarch who finally brought transparency and accountability to the crown. The choice was his, but he had to make it tonight. His security detail was probably already looking for him, and Lord Blackwood was undoubtedly preparing emergency protocols to limit the damage from tomorrow's revelations. But William knew that the real battle wasn't about damage control anymore. It was about the soul of the monarchy itself. Prince William arrived at the secluded hunting lodge just as Prince Henry's car pulled up the gravel driveway. The two brothers hadn't spoken face-to-face in over 6 months, and the tension between them was immediately apparent. Henry looked older, worn down by years of guilt and the weight of secrets he had carried alone. His usually perfect appearance was replaced by casual clothes and an exhausted expression that spoke of sleepless nights and internal battles. "William," Henry said as they embraced awkwardly, "I should have done this years ago. I should have protected Margaret when she needed me most, instead of letting them destroy her while I stood by like a coward." The hunting lodge had been their childhood refuge, a place where they could escape royal protocols and simply be brothers. Tonight, it would serve as their war room as they planned to take on the most powerful forces in the British establishment. William had managed to slip away from his security detail by using old service tunnels beneath the palace. That only family members knew about. Henry pulled out his own phone and began playing recordings he had secretly made during his marriage to Margaret. His voice was shaking as he explained how palace officials had manipulated him into believing that Margaret was mentally unstable and dangerous to the monarchy. "They convinced me that her independence was actually a psychological disorder," Henry said, his voice breaking. "They made me doubt everything about the woman I loved." The brothers listened to a recording of Victoria Sterling coaching Henry on how to gaslight Margaret during private conversations. She had provided him with scripts designed to make Margaret question her own perceptions and memories. "Make her think she's overreacting," Victoria's voice instructed. "Suggest that her concerns are symptoms of instability rather than legitimate grievances." William felt rage building as he heard how systematically they had destroyed his brother's marriage. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Henry showed him financial documents that proved palace officials had been embezzling money from royal charities. using Margaret's access to discover their activities as the pretext for her removal. She found irregularities in the children's foundation accounts, Henry explained. When she started asking questions, they panicked and decided she had to go. Everything else was just cover for their real crime. The embezzlement scheme involved millions of pounds over several years, with money being diverted through shell companies controlled by Lord Blackwood and several other senior palace officials. Margaret had stumbled upon it accidentally while reviewing charity expenditures and had tried to report it through proper channels. Instead of investigating her concerns, they had launched a campaign to discredit her as a whistleblower. William realized that tomorrow's newspaper revelations would expose not just personal vendettas and psychological manipulation, but actual financial crimes that could result in prison sentences for some of the most powerful people in the royal establishment. The stakes were much higher than he had initially understood. Henry continued explaining how the palace had used professional psychological consultants to develop strategies for breaking down Margaret's resistance. They had studied her background, her family relationships, her past traumas, and her cultural differences as an American, then weaponized all of that information against her. They knew exactly how to isolate her from everyone she trusted, Henry said bitterly. They turned me into their weapon against my own wife, and I was too weak to see what was happening until it was too late. The brothers spent hours planning their response to tomorrow's media storm. They knew that Lord Blackwood and his allies would immediately launch a counterattack designed to destroy both Margaret's credibility and their own. The palace would likely claim that Henry was having another breakdown and that William was being manipulated by family loyalty rather than facts, but they also had advantages that the palace establishment didn't expect. Henry had maintained copies of all the financial documents Margaret had discovered, and he had his own recordings of meetings where illegal activities were discussed openly. William had his constitutional authority as heir to the throne, which gave him the power to demand investigations and reforms that palace officials couldn't simply ignore. As dawn approached, the brothers finalized their strategy. William would hold a press conference immediately after Margaret's story broke, publicly supporting her allegations and calling for a full investigation into palace financial practices. Henry would provide corroborating evidence and publicly apologize for his role in Margaret's persecution, but they knew their actions would trigger a constitutional crisis. The palace establishment would likely try to have them both declared unfit for royal duties, potentially leading to their removal from the line of succession. They were risking everything on the belief that truth and justice were more important than preserving their privileged positions. "Are you ready for this?" William asked his brother as they prepared to leave the lodge. "Once we start this fight, there's no going back. They'll try to destroy us both." Henry's response was firm and resolute. "I've been dead inside for 3 years because of what I let them do to Margaret. If fighting back destroys me, at least I'll die as myself instead of their puppet." As the sun rose over the English countryside, the two princes drove back to London knowing that they were about to change the course of British history. In a few hours, Margaret's story would break worldwide, and they would either emerge as reforming heroes or be destroyed by the very institution they were born to serve. William's phone buzzed with an emergency message from his private secretary. "Your Royal Highness, Lord Blackwood has called an emergency meeting of the Privy Council for 9 a.m. They're planning to declare you temporarily unfit to serve due to emotional instability. You need to return immediately." The final battle was about to begin. At exactly 8 a.m., Margaret's explosive story hit newsstands and websites across the globe simultaneously. Royal Palace corruption exposed. Secret recordings reveal systematic abuse and financial crimes, screamed the headlines of major newspapers in London, New York, and Toronto. Within minutes, the revelations were trending worldwide on social media, with millions of people sharing audio clips and demanding answers from the palace. Prince William arrived at Kensington Palace to find it in complete chaos. Security had been doubled. Communications staff were frantically fielding calls from journalists around the world. and senior palace officials were running between emergency meetings like generals coordinating a military response. The carefully controlled world of royal public relations had been blown apart by Margaret's evidence. Lord Blackwood intercepted William before he could reach his office, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Your Royal Highness, we have a catastrophic situation that requires immediate damage control. Lady Margaret's lies are spreading faster than we can counter them, and we need your public support to maintain credibility." But William was no longer the compliant prince they expected. "Lord Blackwood," he replied with icy authority, "I've heard the recordings. I know about the embezzlement, the surveillance, the psychological manipulation. These aren't lies. They're documented crimes." The color drained from Lord Blackwood's face as he realized that William knew everything. For decades, the palace establishment had operated under the assumption that royal family members would always prioritize institutional loyalty over personal conscience. They had never planned for a scenario where an heir to the throne would choose truth over tradition. Meanwhile, Prince Henry was conducting his own press conference at his London residence, providing additional evidence to support Margaret's claims. His appearance was being broadcast live around the world, showing a broken man finally finding the courage to speak truth to power. "I was manipulated into betraying the woman I loved," Henry told the assembled journalists. "The palace turned me into a weapon against my own wife, and I will never forgive myself for being so weak." The financial evidence Henry presented was devastating. Bank records showed millions of pounds being diverted from royal charities into personal accounts controlled by palace officials. Children's hospitals had been denied funding while Lord Blackwood purchased luxury properties in Scotland and the Caribbean. The scope of the corruption went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Back at the palace, Victoria Sterling was in full crisis mode, attempting to coordinate a media response that would discredit both Margaret and Henry simultaneously. But the evidence was too comprehensive and too well documented to dismiss as fabrication. Every recording had been authenticated by independent experts. Every financial document verified by forensic accountants. The government was being drawn into the crisis as well, with the Prime Minister facing parliamentary questions about whether the royal family could continue to receive public funding while under investigation for criminal activity. Opposition leaders were calling for immediate suspension of all royal privileges until the LLAGATIONS could be fully investigated. William's moment of truth came when he was summoned to an emergency meeting of the Privy Council, the ancient body of advisers that could theoretically remove him from the line of succession. The meeting was being held in the throne room, with its imposing portraits of past monarchs looking down on the assembled officials like silent judges. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Blackwood began formally, "this council has serious concerns about your recent behavior and judgment. Your association with these malicious attacks on the crown suggests a mental instability that may render you unfit for future royal duties." The other council members nodded gravely, but William could see fear in their eyes. They weren't just trying to protect the monarchy. They were trying to protect themselves from criminal prosecution. Several of them were implicated in Margaret's evidence, having participated in or benefited from the corruption she had exposed. William stood before the council and delivered the speech that would define his legacy. "Gentlemen, I have reviewed the evidence that Lady Margaret has provided, and I find it credible and deeply disturbing. Rather than questioning my fitness to serve, perhaps this council should question its own fitness to advise the crown." He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The systematic abuse of power, the financial crimes, the persecution of anyone who dared to speak truth to authority, these are not the actions of people worthy of public trust. If this council attempts to remove me for supporting transparency and accountability, then perhaps the time has come to abolish this entire system of unelected advisers." The threat was clear and constitutional. As heir to the throne, William had the authority to recommend fundamental changes to the structure of royal governance. If the Privy Council tried to remove him, he could potentially disband the council itself, stripping its members of their titles and privileges. The standoff lasted for several tense minutes. with neither side willing to back down completely. Finally, Sir James Hartwell, the security chief, broke the silence. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps we should focus on investigating these allegations rather than debating fitness for service. If crimes have been committed, they should be prosecuted regardless of the political consequences." It was a stunning betrayal of Lord Blackwood by his own ally. But Sir James had clearly calculated that his best chance of survival was to distance himself from the corruption and align with William's reform agenda. The unity of the palace establishment was cracking under pressure. The meeting ended without any formal action being taken against William, but the lines of battle had been clearly drawn. The old guard, led by Lord Blackwood and Victoria Sterling, would fight to preserve their power and avoid prosecution. The reformers, led by William and supported by Henry, would push for complete transparency and accountability. As news of the Privy Council meeting leaked to the press, public opinion began to solidify around support for Margaret and the princes who stood with her. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace, with crowds demanding the resignation of corrupt palace officials and applauding William's courage in challenging the establishment. The monarchy was facing its greatest crisis in centuries. But it was also being offered an opportunity for redemption through the courage of those willing to choose truth over comfort. 3 weeks after Margaret's revelations shook the world, the full extent of the palace corruption scandal continued to unfold with devastating consequences for the old guard. Lord Blackwood had been arrested on charges of embezzlement and money laundering, his decades of service to the crown ending in handcuffs and perp walks past photographers. Victoria Sterling had fled to Switzerland, hoping her connections there would provide sanctuary from extradition requests. Prince William stood in his private study, reviewing the preliminary report from the independent investigation he had commissioned. The scope of the corruption was even worse than Margaret's initial evidence had suggested. Financial irregularities dating back 15 years, surveillance operations against dozens of royal family members and palace employees, and a systematic pattern of destroying anyone who questioned palace authority. Margaret had returned to London the previous week, no longer the isolated and broken woman who had fled to Canada 3 years earlier. The global support for her courage had transformed her into an international symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. She had been invited to testify before Parliament, speak at universities around the world, and consult on reforms for other monarchies facing similar scandals. The reunion between Margaret and Henry had been emotional and complex. While both acknowledged that their romantic relationship could never be restored after everything they had endured, they had found a way to work together as allies in pursuing justice for all the victims of palace abuse. Their shared trauma had created an unbreakable bond of mutual respect and understanding. Public opinion polls showed unprecedented support for William's reform agenda, with over 70% of British citizens approving of his decision to expose palace corruption despite the damage to royal prestige. International observers praised his courage in choosing institutional integrity over personal comfort, comparing him favorably to historical figures who had sacrificed privilege for principle. The investigation had uncovered evidence of similar corruption in other Commonwealth monarchies, leading to a coordinated international effort to reform royal institutions across multiple countries. Margaret's bravery had inspired other victims to come forward, creating a global movement for transparency and accountability in hereditary power structures, but the victory had come at significant personal cost. William's relationship with his father remained strained, as the king struggled to accept that fundamental changes were necessary for the monarchy's survival. Several elderly relatives had cut off contact entirely, viewing William's actions as a betrayal of family loyalty and royal tradition. The reformed palace operated very differently under William's new leadership structure. Financial transparency had become mandatory, with all royal expenditures published quarterly for public review. Palace staff underwent regular ethics training, and independent oversight committees monitored all major decisions to prevent future abuse of power. Margaret had established a foundation to support other victims of institutional abuse, using her settlement money from the palace to fund legal aid and counseling services. Her work had already helped dozens of former palace employees, royal family members, and other powerful institution whistleblowers find justice and healing. Henry had undergone extensive therapy to address the psychological damage from years of manipulation and guilt. He had chosen to step back from most royal duties, instead focusing on mental health advocacy and supporting other men who had been victimized by abusive power structures. His honesty about his own failures had helped break down stigma around male victims of psychological abuse. The new generation of palace officials, carefully vetted for integrity and competence, brought fresh perspectives to royal communications and operations. They prioritized authenticity over image management, allowing royal family members to be more genuine in their public appearances and statements. Sarah Shun, the journalist who had first reported Margaret's story, continued investigating similar patterns of abuse in other elite institutions. Her work had expanded beyond the royal family to expose corruption in government agencies, corporate boardrooms, and international organizations. She had become one of the world's most respected investigative reporters, known for her meticulous documentation and fearless pursuit of truth. As William prepared for his eventual coronation, he knew that his reign would be defined by the principles he had established during this crisis. Transparency, accountability, and respect for human dignity would guide every decision, even when those principles conflicted with traditional royal prerogatives. The monarchy had survived its greatest challenge in centuries, but it had been fundamentally transformed in the process. What emerged was a more democratic, ethical, and sustainable institution that served the public interest rather than protecting elite privilege. Margaret's courage had not only saved her own dignity, but had potentially saved the monarchy itself by forcing it to evolve or face abolition. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, William received a handwritten letter from Margaret, now living peacefully in London and pursuing her advocacy work. Her words perfectly captured the significance of what they had accomplished together. Your Royal Highness, 3 years ago I believed that speaking truth to power would destroy everything I cared about. Instead, it saved everything that truly mattered. Thank you for choosing justice over comfort and truth over tradition. The monarchy you will lead deserves the respect it will finally earn through integrity, rather than inherit through blood. The letter sat on his desk as a permanent reminder that real leadership required moral courage, and that sometimes the greatest service to an institution was forcing it to confront its own failures and commit to becoming worthy of the trust it sought to command.